You guys know what Tomcat is? All right, let's move on. So why do we need to encrypt our connections? It seems pretty obvious to me, but I like to run down some of the reasons why we do this. A lot of people think, if you don't have anything to hide, then why are you bothering encrypting things? Well, the reality is that even if you have a completely static, not really necessary encrypted site, bad things can happen. So there's, you could think of any stupid site. You have a vanity domain, and all it has is a picture of you, and you and your kids are waving, and it says, like, here's my email address. If you're not using an encrypted connection, specifically over TLS or SSL, one that's been authenticated and encrypted, anyone who's in a network position between you and them can just arbitrarily change that page. So if you're advertising your email address, they'll just replace it with something else. And then suddenly all the email that you would expect to get is going to somebody else and they're impersonating you. That's like a pretty contrived example, but the point is you don't have to have logins. You don't have to have healthcare data. You don't have to have social security numbers. You don't have to have anything that's truly important on your website to actually care about encrypting that connection and authenticate and your users authenticating that connection. Man in the middle is bad no matter who you are. You don't have to be Microsoft to be worried about man in the middle. If your WordPress site can be man in the middle, that's not good either. TLS is magic sauce, which works great. I'm going to skip a handful of these because I think it's more important to talk about how to do this. It's worth discussing how public key infrastructure works. Because a lot of people don't understand this, and we get a lot of questions. I just want to set up my Tomcat or my HTTPD. I want to change the HTTP to HTTPS. Like, why is this so complicated? And the reason it's complicated is you don't just put a password in your configuration file and call it a day. Your browser trusts, I hope I have a diagram of this. Yes. Your browser trusts a list of certificate authorities. They never trust you directly. And in order for them to trust you indirectly, the certificate authority needs to establish trust for you. And the way Let's Encrypt does that is through that domain validation. There are a handful of types of validation for TLS certificates. And I think the most basic is domain validated. There's also there's like organization validated, which nobody bothers using. And then there's extended validation. So if you guys are running sites that are dealing with payments or anything that your customers probably want to have an added layer of security, then you're probably getting an extended validation certificate, and that's where the CA will do checks to make sure that not only do you control the domain, but it makes sense for you to control the domain. So, does the name of your business have anything to do with your domain? Is your address verifiable? Can we find you on? Can we get a Dun Bradstreet report on you? Things like that. Make sure that you're a legitimate organization. Let's Encrypt doesn't actually do those. They have no plans to do it. They just wanted super simple domain validated certificates. Kind of covered that already. I do want to point out that Let's Encrypt is not trying to take down the certificate authority infrastructure that others provide. They want to make it so that if you want encryption on your site, you can get it for free, period. They don't do anything fancy. If you need a certificate that's got a lot of bells and whistles on it, don't go to Let's Encrypt. If you have a WordPress site and you just want to click a button and make it happen, that's where they really want to come in. So I say here, mundane TLS the cost needs to go to 0, and that's what they've achieved. So this gets into exactly how you do things, and we're just going to peel back the layers, describing and then showing exactly how to do this kind of thing. So the plan is to request a certificate from Let's Encrypt, And then periodically, they ask that the certificates expire after 90 days. And you don't want to wait until day 89 to request the replacement, just in case something goes wrong. So they recommend that you do it around 50 or 60 days. And actually, their recommendation is that you set up a scheduled job that runs every week. And the client software knows when the expiration is going to occur. So it will run weekly, and when you get into the 50, 60-day period, that's when it will stop saying, no, I'm not even going to try, not even going to bother doing this right now, and it will actually start making requests to Let's Encrypt. So I have a couple of sites, Let's Encrypt is working with them, and even though they have a 90-day cert, they roll over after about 60 days. And then it seems pretty clear based on the title of the presentation, we're going to put that certificate into Tomcat and get it running. So I mentioned, I say that it's Let's Encrypt tool. It's actually the Electronic Frontier Foundation's tool called CertBot. So there's a tool, command line. You can get your cert on the command line very easily. Requesting a renewal is also easy. CertBot again. And then I say cron here. For those in the Windows world, it's Windows Task Scheduler or whatever. And then installing the certificate in Tomcat is getting more straightforward, but it's not super obvious how to do this. I wrote this presentation a couple of years ago when we had virtually nothing. A lot of things have improved at this point. And I'm hoping that in a year or two I can give a presentation which is one slide which just says, type this into your config file and you're finished. I saw a presentation yesterday by a gentleman who was talking about Apache Traffic Server, and that's essentially what they've achieved. I think Tomcat would like to take a different approach to that and say that instead of all the tooling and everything you get as a part of Tomcat's default distribution, I think you should probably have to add some things in. And I think that's just because I don't want to bloat the product. Don't hear me say that I think their product is bloated. I just think that ours is a little bit different, and the use cases are different enough that I think it makes more sense to do this a different way for Tomcat. So a couple of problems with Tomcat which can complicate this process is generally nobody's running Tomcat on port 80. Let's Encrypt needs to do its domain validation by making a request to that domain, and it requires that it be done over port 80. If you could do it over port 808080, then anybody who's running in rack space could stand up a server in a random place, somehow manage to get that weird port forwarded into their infrastructure, and then get a domain validated certificate to that. So they require that you do it on port 80, and generally people are running Tomcat on port 80. Tomcat uses key stores. That's part of its Java legacy, sadly. That's getting a little bit better. And then also, Tomcat's Graceful Reload is not super easy to use. And I mentioned earlier that a one command on the command line can get you a certificate installed in HTTPD. In HTTPD, there's a Graceful Restart command that you can give to it, which allows all in-flight requests to complete. New requests will be served by new instances of the server. Basically, it's as close to zero downtime as you can possibly get.
Is there any, sorry, do you mind questions?
Not at all.
Is there any interest in adding that to Tomcat?
There was, and it's there. So
the interest is there, or
the interest was there, and now it's been implemented, so the interest is irrelevant.
Oh, okay. So that's done. Okay.
Yeah. In fact, I'll get there. We don't have a graceful restart. So the I think we're good to go for now. Yeah.
But it might be good to keep that one.
No, the cable still has a problem because as soon as you nudged it, it blinks basically.
Oh, did it?
So
okay.
Yeah.
Should I replace this cable now?
Yeah.
If you could replace it maybe half an hour, that would be great.
Yeah, 3.5 hours.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so so solutions to some of these issues. Tomcat can do port binding in a number of different ways. I like using IP tables because that's the environment in which I live, and I know how to do it. There's also a a native wrapper for Java processes called JSVC. It allows the native wrapper to, as running as root, obtain resources from the operating system, and then drop its privileges, and then go boot the Java virtual machine. I don't believe there are truly any security issues with that, but it sort of makes me feel icky, so I don't really like the JSVC concept. There's actually, in my opinion, a better way to do this depending on your environment, but somebody help me with the name of this. It's called like authbind or portbind or something like that. There's a Linux infrastructure. Was it authbind? Yeah, in configuration files you can basically say the Tomcat process is allowed to bind to this port. Just let it happen, and it does. It's great. For Java key stores, you can import PDM files. Those are the files you've probably seen that have the header at the top that says begin public certificate or begin certificate and end certificate. I find those a lot easier to work with than key stores. And Remy mentioned in the previous presentation that now, regardless of the type of connector that you use, you can use PEM files directly. So I won't be covering that today in this presentation just because you might want to know how to go through that extra process, but it is worth pointing out that you can use these files now. The Tomcat reloads can be done without downtime, and the in-process requests do complete before the new certificate is put into effect. It's pretty much zero time.
How do you do the reload?
I'll show you. So getting the first Let's Encrypt cert, I'm going to just demonstrate how you can fake port 80 with IP tables. And for those who are not aware, it's not only a firewall, but you can do all kinds of other stuff. And what we'll do is we will redirect port 80 to port 8080. You obviously need administrative access to do that, but the whole point is that Tomcat should not be running as root. It's fine to reroute network as root, but you don't want to run Tomcat as root. So in times that I've shown this before, a lot of people pull out their phones like this and try to take a picture of this. Just get the slides, because then you can copy and paste it. And this is not the command, this is just what we're going to do. So in the network address translation pre-routing, we're going to forward port 80 to 8080, and then we're going to unforward 8080 back to 80 because it needs to go round trip. And then we're going to do the same thing with 443 just for completeness. And you also may need to tell it explicitly that the NAT needs to accept data coming through. The forward filter needs to accept those two things so that it can actually cross from the external boundary to the internal boundary. So those are the actual commands that you'll need to use. And I've used that to great effect for quite a while now. And this is the possible optional ones. Okay, so I think this is pretty complete, but I wrote it a few years ago, so perhaps there's a bit of difference here. We are using this web root here. That specifies that you're not going to use the magic HTTPD authentication where it automatically does everything for you. What it does is it's going to take the token that comes from Let's Encrypt and it's going to install it in there. That's just the standard root application that you would get from a Tomcat install if you just unzipped or untarred the distro right onto your disk. So there's no magic going on here. Web root specifies the type of authentication, and then the path tells the tool where to drop the file. This is the domain for which we're requesting a certificate, and then this is not necessary, but I always put it on there because not everybody thinks about what size key they want. The default is still 2048 as far as I know, and I think that's too low. So you can do whatever you want, but I think you should go higher. Now we need to reconfigure Tomcat to use the TLS certificates, and I went through a process of kind of playing with it to see how I could swap from one certificate to another. So what we're going to do is we're going to start with a self-signed certificate, just go through the process of how would you do this the long way. If you run this monster command, it will generate a self-signed TLS certificate for your site. The host name is localhost, and then I specifically called the organizational unit here key store number 1. It's going to ask you a handful of questions when you run this command, and I said let's use key store number 1 because I want to differentiate it from key store number 2, which I'll get to in a second. So generate a second key store number 2. Command is exactly the same, except probably here .2. If I back up, which I'll do, probably change back to a 1. Yes, it does. Okay. So generate 2 nearly identical self-signed certificates. I mean, they're wildly different from each other, but operationally they're identical. And then symlink one of them to just the name that I'm going to use in the configuration file. Configure the connector in Tomcat. There you go. There's a bunch of other things that you can put in there, but the only important ones are that we're going to bind to port 8443, which is being forwarded, and the key store file here points to my symlink, which then points to key store number 1. Start Tomcat, verify the connection. This is a pair of OpenSSL commands that you can use to, why is that on there twice? I don't know why you'd use both of them. Okay, that's an OpenSSL command line that you can issue to just say, check this thing out, show me the certificate, and then you can verify it's the one that you put in there. So the previous 2 slides plus this one are just quick and dirty how to set up TLS on Tomcat.
But in this case, you're only using 8443, right?
Yeah, the second command will take.
Oh, right. This one goes to 443, but it's been forwarded using IP tables. So this one goes directly,
Right.
and this one goes through the redirected port mapper, essentially.
Yeah.
And so now I know why I had both of them. You want to make sure that that's working. All right. So to reconfigure, you remove the symlink, you resymlink to the other one, and then question mark. And this was the question that I was asking myself several years ago before we had some nice reloading. So how do you reconfigure Tomcat's TLS while it's running? That's not super straightforward, but Tomcat exposes protocol handlers, which are the things that manage all of the communications, via Jmx. So if you were to pull up Visual VM and connect to your Tomcat, you would see a bunch of mbeans under the Catalina header, protocol handler, and then underneath the protocol handler, you'll find each one based on the port number. And you can ignore the port numbers that I've got in here because I got a weirdo configuration. If you find a protocol handler in JMX, you'll see that there is a callable function called reload SSL host configs. And that was added in 8.5.32 and 9.0 something about the same time as 8.0.32. But if it's there, it's reliable. So, to reconfigure Tomcat's TLS, you connect to Tomcat via JMX, you navigate over there, you invoke this operation, you verify the connection using that OpenSSL. So manually deploying that is pretty inconvenient. You're not going to use Visual VM in production. It's going to take a while. You're going to have to do it every few weeks for every server, and that obviously doesn't scale. The whole point is to make this all automated so that once you set it up, you don't have to think about it basically ever again. So we need to automate this. And these are the 3 operations we need to automate. Same thing we just did. Renew the certificate, build a new key store, and reload the key store. So to renew a Let's Encrypt certificate, it's pretty easy. You run the certbot command, and it does the renewal. It doesn't do any of the other things, but you're halfway there, or a third of the way there, I suppose. The second thing you need to do is package the server key, which is generated on the fly as part of that renewal. You'll get a new key as well as a new certificate every time you get a new certificate issued. So that's important to know, but it's not super important for the whole process because You could use the same key for your whole life and get certs over and over again, but there's no real good reason to reuse a key. Generate a key, get a cert, throw them both out, generate a new key, get a new cert. If that key's compromised for whatever reason, even if you don't know it, especially if you don't know it, you should get rid of it. So rotate both of them. So we'll package the server key and certificate into a PKCS12 file, which is the P12 extension frequently. And we'll celebrate after that. And then reload Tomcat's key store. So that was the part that really needs a little bit more automation than when we were doing a visual VM earlier. I am a huge fan of Jmx Proxy Servlet. I probably mentioned it in every single presentation I ever give. It allows you to make an HTTP request to Tomcat's manager application and fiddle with JMX. So you don't have to spin up a JVM, make a JMX connection, which is a whole thing, and then do whatever you want to and then shut down the JVM. You can use curl from the command line and bang, do whatever you want. So you do need to enable the manager application. And you really should configure a realm with proper security. If you're interested in asking questions about that, stick around till later today. I have a presentation on security in Tomcat, and I will talk about that. Yeah.
The proxy servlet, is that specific to Tomcat, or can you use it with any JMX managed application?
That's a good question.
Because I've never heard of this before.
My sense is that
Sounds cool.
My sense is that you could yank it out of Tomcat and use it anywhere. There's nothing, as far as I know, that's Tomcat specific about it, because it just grabs the platform JMX server and pokes at it. But I've never tried it.
I would think it's all very standard APIs that are part of the specifications, so it should work.
Just as a coincidence, a day or two ago, I started working with a JMX managed theme, so I'm like, hey, okay.
All right, I've got 15 minutes. So the last thing you need to do is reload. Now, this is impossible to read, I understand. But what we're doing is we're calling a URL in the manager, and we're specifically calling the Jmx proxy, and then we're saying we're invoking some big long thing. And the big long thing that you're invoking is you need to provide the full path to the JMX bean, and then the name of the operation. So the name of the operation here is at the end, reload SSL hosts configs. And actually you can celebrate, and I should have had an exclamation point on it. So I have a script which is in the same directory as, or rather in the same folder on the web server as you can find this presentation. The link will be at the end again. Basically, you execute these 3 commands and you're good to go. The script that I have has a lot of checking to make sure that everything worked the way that it should, but essentially, these 3 commands run every week will keep your server running with Let's Encrypt until you choose to take it down.
So if you're the type that doesn't like to celebrate, you can say 3 steps?
Say that again?
If you're the type that doesn't like to celebrate much, you can save 3 steps, right?
That's correct. You can go from 6 steps and go down to 3 if you just get rid of all the celebrating, yes. So this allows CRL reloading as well. We get questions all the time at Tomcat about how do I reload my certificate revocation list, which, spoiler alert, doesn't work. Like, sorry, CRL, like, forget about it. You should be using OCSP. So that's why I say if you like that kind of thing, if you need to reload any part of your configuration, you can do this. If you want to change the ciphers, the cipher suites that are available, if you want to change the protocols that you're supporting, which is a little bit weird, but if you find out on a Friday afternoon that, oh my God, AES, all cipher suites based on AES are compromisable trivially, and you don't want to take your service down, don't. Just rip them out of your config and tell it to reload. You can also add other certificates. So if you wanted to, you've been using RSA for a long time, and you're like, hey, let's try an elliptic curve certificate. Pop it in there and reload your config. Uh-oh, not working? Well, yank it out and reconfigure. You don't have to take your server down anymore. So this was much more exciting like a year or 2 ago, and it was actually possible for the first time. And it's nice that this works for all the connector types. So it doesn't matter whether you're using APR, NIO, et cetera, bar the versions that it's available for. So you can't get this in Tomcat 7 or earlier than that. So if you're still using Tomcat 7, maybe bump it up a level. Review. Okay, so Let's Encrypt has free certificates. You must automate. I've forgotten where I got it, but I have a T-shirt at home. I think it was from one of these conferences, like ApacheCon. It says "Automate or Die." Yeah, you need to automate, or you're going to be wasting a lot of time on this. And what's really great is, so I do for my company, I get traditional extended validation certificates every 2 years, and I always have to send an email, and they always have to call me, and there's this whole process that you have to go through. Ultimately, it only probably takes about 90 minutes of my brain time to get it done, but it's frustrating, and I don't have to deal with it, and then I need to remember to put it in the right places and restart the services in the way that they need to be done, and it's a whole thing. If you can automate it, and you can just have your computer do it for you, it's wonderful. Tomcat is a little bit more complicated than working with HTTPD, for example, but all these complications can be overcome. My goal in creating this presentation when I did was actually to get the attention of the folks who are writing things like certbot, because it would be great if certbot already knew how to, for example, reload a Tomcat by poking at its connector. So you could say, here's the information you need about my protocol handler, and just tell me when you're done. That hasn't happened yet, but my plan is to work with the certbot community. There's also another one called like Autobot or something like that I'd like to work with to get that to work as well. That's all I had for this. I am happy to answer questions, starting with Igal.
Yeah. So, is there a reason not to expose the reload of the connector with the API? So you can just
You mean
automatically?
instead of using JMX?
Yeah.
There's not any particular reason, but I don't think I suppose an application can just grab the platform JMX
Right,
server
and
and do
then you
it.
can create a hook, whatever hook you want in your application.
So the application can already use JMX if it wants to. It's
Right.
pretty straightforward. I don't know if you didn't want to use JMX how you'd have to do that. It's the short answer is it's so easy to use JMX, you may as well do that. But if there's a compelling reason to not do it through JMX, then it could be added. You'd have to figure out how to do it in a way that didn't tie the application to the container. At least I would want to do it that way, because I love Tomcat and I've never used any other application server.
One
But
reason actually that comes to mind, and I'm sure that Fermi will talk about it, is that if you compile to native, and I'm not even sure if that's right now feasible or not, you need to disable JMX.
fair enough. So that's probably the best argument I've heard for exposing that in some way. So maybe we'll take a look at how to do that. Anybody else? Questions? Yeah.
You just want to play around with it and you don't know the domain. Like, is there any way to persuade you to give us for local or something like that?
So the question for anybody who couldn't hear it was, if you want a local host certificate from Let's Encrypt because you want to play around and you don't have your own domain, can you do that? The answer is full stop, no. You cannot. They won't give certificates for IP addresses, and they won't give certificates for localhost. So if you want to play around with it, I have not bothered looking around for this kind of thing, but Acme is an open protocol. There's probably an Acme server that you can find that you can run yourself and set up your own certificate authority, which will then issue certificates signed by that CA. So you could play around with it, but I don't know. Domain names aren't that expensive.
I would think that they
Still
will
get one.
not allow it because they must validate your domain. So it's part of the process. I mean, that's
Right. But if you run your own Acme and CA inside your own network, for example, you could do that. You just,
Right.
it wouldn't be Let's Encrypt that's,
Exactly.
that's checking it for you. Any other questions? Yeah.
How do you think it makes sense to implement in Java?
Does it make sense to implement it in Java? You mean instead of doing scripting outside? So, somebody help me out with his last name. Roman from the Tommy project. He's got the hyphenated last name. I've forgotten what it is. Anyway,
Manny Bracco or-
on GitHub there is I think it's a valve or might be a servlet that's wired in with a background thread. But there is a Java implementation of this that will work in Tomcat and I think other application servers as well. It fully implements the Acme protocol, and I chose not to import that into Tomcat because I don't think it should be a core component. But it looks like if you configure it, it runs itself, so it sort of self-hosts its own renewal process. It's much more complicated than what I have put in this presentation.
It doesn't work on Windows.
Sorry?
This one, it doesn't work on Windows.
So Certbot works on Windows, and curl works on Windows, and Keytool works on Windows.
It's something like Symlink where you change the swap on Windows.
Oh, so the symlink was just my own investigation for how to swap back and forth between between two key stores. That's not necessary for this at runtime. So if you wanted to do this on Windows, you could write Bash or PowerShell, or you could run Bash. So the script that I've prepared that you can find on the site is written in Bash. If you'd like to convert that into something that's a little bit more Windows friendly, if you'd like to do PowerShell, I'd be happy to share it with anyone who sees this presentation or hears about it.
We just override the port forwarding for firewall
Mm-hmm.
on Tomcat, so we usually use Apache.
Okay.
So we use that and then we export it manually.
Okay. Well, if you're using HTTPD as a reverse proxy, you're probably doing your TLS negotiation out there, right?
Yeah, because HTTPD is might make more sense to put it from.
Yeah. Yeah, so in that case, if you're using a reverse proxy, I wouldn't bother with Let's Encrypt in Tomcat. I would do it at the reverse proxy layer, and then do something else with Tomcat. Probably just a simple self-sign.
If you like, say, dual web services, and you want security, HTTPS.
Mm-hmm. I mean, you can do that with self-signed certificates as well. There's nothing bad about self-signed certificate. It's just you don't want to expose a self-signed certificate to the outside world.
And then give it a lifetime of 10 years.
Right. So you can do that. It's not a great idea. And I admit I've done that once or twice.
They don't work all the time with self-signed certificates. That's when you want to do some service. And in Java, you sometimes need to override some functionality to see if it's original destination.
Yes, so what he's saying up here is if you want to do a self-signed certificate for your own internal service, I'm paraphrasing, it's complicated when your other services need to contact it. How do they know who to trust, right?
Yeah.
So there's two ways to do that. One is you can distribute those certificates in the trust stores of all of your other services. Or, if you want to get crazy, you can create your own certificate authority and sign those certificates and then trust the top level CA. So that's something that I've not seen too many people doing just because they don't really think about it or it's a pain in the neck. But I've done it, and once you set up your own internal CA and you can trust that CA, it makes a lot of things a lot easier to do. So if you invest an afternoon in learning how to create a CA that can sign other certificates and then figuring out how to sign them, you can get a lot of mileage out of that for your internal services.
Last question.
Yeah, go ahead. I stopped early, so I think.
What about DNS? It's another way to do that you mentioned that you can add a DNS record.
Yes, you can.
So
You have to add a
investigate how
DNS
to
text
automate
record.
that because it's taking a lot of time, like 40 minutes maybe. An hour.
I don't think that's a great way to do it on a single server basis. Apparently, that's a lot easier if you're operating like a content distribution network. If you're running a CDN and you can do quick DNS changes, which is what the guys at Traffic Server were doing, for instance. They based everything on the DNS validation, and I had the same concerns you do about DNS propagation, because you can't just change your DNS and wait 5 seconds and then expect Let's Encrypt to be able to pull that DNS record. So that's why I did it using the token that is done via HTTP request.
They usually ask to add some records, specific records to user name, yes? Specific name, like a long, like random URL, you have to add to your DNS.
I think what they ask you to do is you have to add a subdomain. So it's something like _acme _ blah 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 .whatever.com. And I think once that is available to Let's Encrypt, that's how they do it. I haven't looked really carefully into how they do it.
Because just personal experience, it's sometimes in corporate environment pretty hard to go say, okay, I need you to give me access to that folder.
Right.
So you need to use URL rewrites that say forward you to specific host, because you have to leave behind that URL anyway. If you don't behind, so if you have trouble doing that, you need to go shuffle around.
Yeah, it gets very complicated, and I haven't looked too much into it, but forgotten who's doing it. There is a certbot-like tool which you can use in Amazon, where it will automatically configure the application load balancer to send requests for the Acme challenge to the host where you are running the renewal. So if you have 500 web servers and only one of them has the token on it, you need to make sure that the request comes to that server. And so some of that is automated for you if you use certain tools and certain infrastructures. Otherwise, it's pretty much up to you.
Oops, broke again.
Yeah, that was my time.
All right, I think
All
it's
right.
lunchtime.
Yeah.
So thanks a lot.